Ohio gozaimasu from planet Kerbal. We're back in Kerbal Space Program. Today we're going to do another tutorial. The lesson of today is basic orbital mechanics. Since orbiting is sort of the bread and butter of this game, it's important to at least understand the basics of it. If you're having trouble figuring it out, if you're having trouble understanding it, don't feel discouraged, because orbital mechanics get really counterintuitive really fast. The rules don't apply up in space the same way they do down here on Earth. You notice I have made a couple of changes to our workhorse, but it's otherwise identical. I just added some lights so that we can see the damn thing on the backside of the planet. So we should start by saying what an orbit is. What is an orbit? An orbit is a straight path through space that has been curved by the gravitational influence of a celestial body. Technically speaking, any path that has been curved by gravity can be considered an orbit, even if it just does a quick pass by the planet, never to be seen again. But for our purposes here in Kerbal Space Program, let's narrow that definition down a little bit, and let's just say that an orbit, in our case, is going to be any path that has been closed into a closed loop. So right now we're in an orbit because it has a closed loop, and the moon is in orbit around Kerbal, closed loop, and then we've got Minmus here, closed loop, and if we go further out we see these little objects here. Now, I don't have their trajectories right at the moment, but there's a good chance that their orbits, at least as far as Kerbal is concerned, their orbits around Kerbal are not closed loops. They're probably going to pass by Kerbal at some point or another, although they probably are orbiting the sun. Their influence is going to be affected by Kerbal. You could technically say that's an orbit, but not for our cases here today. And that tells you what an orbit looks like, but that doesn't really tell us what an orbit is. So, what is an orbit? If you think about it, an orbit is actually some poor schmuck or piece of machinery or whatever, or a moon, let's say a moon, that is being pulled to the ground of another body, something larger usually, but it's moving so fast that instead of hitting the ground, it actually misses the ground. Imagine that. You're traveling so fast, you're falling so fast that you actually miss the ground. That's sort of what's happening here. Instead of using the skydiver analogy of somebody falling straight towards the planet, let's use more like a ski jump. On a ski jump, the ski jump ramp is usually built in, say, the middle of a hill, and once a ski jumper gets airborne, the ground beneath him drops away from him as he travels. Roughly about the same speed that he's falling towards the ground. So for every foot that he's falling towards the ground, the hill is sloped so that the ground is just a little bit less than a foot further away from him than it started. For every 10 feet that he falls, the ground is about 9 feet further down than when he started. That's what an orbit is. You're traveling so fast, parallel to the ground, that the curvature of the Earth takes the ground just a little bit further away from you by the time gravity pulls you down. For every foot you drop, the curvature of the Earth has made it so that the ground is now a foot further away, so you can basically fall forever. Now, it's not accurate to say that our workhorse here is in zero gravity. It's actually probably about an eighth, or about 80% of the gravity that you'd feel on the surface of Earth. It's less gravity, but it's not zero gravity. The actual correct term is free fall, because that's exactly what you're doing. You're falling. You're falling at an angle, essentially. That makes this number here very important. This is your linear velocity, your orbital velocity. The closer you are to the ground, the faster you have to go to be able to cover that same distance to make sure that the curvature of the Earth is doing what you needed to do in order to prevent you from hitting it. The further out you go from a planet, should be in this screen, this ship here is traveling at a different speed, you notice, velocity 2244, than this one up here, a little bit further out, traveling at a slower speed, still in a stable orbit. That's because it doesn't have to move as fast around the planet in order for the curvature of the planet to counteract the amount that gravity is pulling it down. Now, if you get further and further and further out, I don't have one set up here in geostationary orbit, but geostationary orbit is an orbit that is so far out that the satellite matches the speed of rotation of the planet. So not only is it traveling just far enough that for every foot gravity pulls it down, the ground is a foot further away, but also the planet has now rotated so that the same point is always under the satellite, theoretically, depending on what your inclination is. Inclination is a measurement of how far away or how close to the planet's equator you are. This right here, let's bring up Kerbal Engineer to give us our inclination reading here. So, if you're hovering exactly over a planet's equator, then you have an inclination of 0. That is 0 degrees deviation from the equator of the planet. Now, the moon here has an inclination of 0. So, if you ever want to know what your inclination is, you can sort of ballpark it with the moon. It's a little bit hard to do some of the geometry in your head, but if you set the moon as your target, you can see a bunch of new stuff comes up on the screen, and we'll get to some of that. But for now, let's just focus on our blue line where our Workhorse is currently orbiting, and this little guy right here. I actually thought that I set this to exactly 0, so that's interesting. But you notice it's called descending node, is at negative... Stupid microphone. My descending node is at 0.2 degrees. Right. And that's actually matched over here. It's rounding down a little bit, or rounding up a little bit, I should say. But it's there. It has a little bit of an inclination. The moon's orbit is exactly 0 degrees, exactly over the equator. So we're a tiny, tiny bit off. And you can always see what your inclination is relative to another object. Minmus, on the other hand, where is Minmus? Minmus. That's Tylo. That's not Minmus. Where the hell did the moon go? There it is. Since our inclination is pretty much 0, pretty close to it, we can actually see the difference. You notice that Minmus's orbit, according to our orbit here, is now 6.1 degrees difference. So that means that Minmus has an inclination of about 6 degrees. The further out you go away from the equator, the higher your inclination gets. Let's switch here, and we'll see that one of our spacecraft that we'll be using next time has an inclination of 31 degrees. You can get up to a minimum of a 0 degree inclination. That's exactly over the equator, all the way up to his maximum a 90 degree inclination, which would be passing over the poles, called a polar orbit. The inclinations are very important, especially when you're doing planetary intercepts, like I just said. Minmus is a little bit off kilter compared to the moon. If you want to try and get to the moon, you want to start out with a more or less 0 inclination, because the moon's on a more or less 0 inclination. But if you want to get to Minmus, you want to tilt your inclination a little bit to match it first, so it'll make the intercept a lot easier. But we're going to cover all that later. We're just defining terms today. Let's go back to the Workhorse here. So the next thing on the list here is eccentricity. Remember what I said the last time. Your orbit is never completely circular. Now, theoretically, in Kerbal Space Program, you could get these two numbers to be exactly the same if you wanted to sit here and really be tedious about it. But in general terms, you're always going to have one point in your orbit that's a little bit lower and one point that's a little bit higher. The highest point is your apoapsis. Your lowest point is your periapsis. And the difference between these 2 points gives you your eccentricity. It's basically a measurement of how circular your orbit is. The closer you are to 100% circular, the lower the number goes, all the way down to 0 for being a completely 100% circular orbit. Now you see my eccentricity is actually really close. An eccentricity of 1, on the other hand, would be an orbit that is no longer a closed loop. We're calling that a trajectory. So anything in between 0 and 1 would be a closed loop orbit, and depending on where you're at and what kind of influences there are, maybe you're still in orbit around the planet, maybe you're not. Orbital period is how long it takes you to make one single orbit. Here it's taking us 32 minutes to make a lap around the planet. Longitude of the ascending node we're not going to worry about. Time to apoapsis, time to periapsis. Oh, all that stuff is pretty simple. So that gives us the basics on orbits and how they work. Another interesting note is that your periapsis is not only the closest point that your orbit gets to your planet, it's also going to be the point where you're traveling the fastest. Versus your apoapsis, which is going to be the highest point in your orbit, but also going to be when you're traveling the absolute slowest. That becomes an issue later on, especially when we start doing maneuvers. Now, let's bring up the orb here. These things were covered in the tutorial, but I'll just go through them quickly. Oh, kind of locked there. That's weird. So this icon right here means prograde. What prograde means is the direction that you are orbiting is also the direction that you are facing. So this is the direction that I'm moving towards. Now I'm also facing the direction I'm moving. Since we're in space, we don't necessarily have to be facing the direction we're moving, not like a car. For example, we can turn completely around. Now I'm facing retrograde, the opposite direction of the direction I'm traveling. I can tilt down. Oh, it doesn't have the normal. Okay. So these markers aren't actually on the orb. Oops. These markers aren't actually on the orb, but now I'm facing upwards. This is called facing normal. And if I pitch downwards, oops, this is anti-normal. Now, I actually tried to find the definition for this online. I couldn't find it. So if you find it, go ahead and feel free to define it yourself, but I don't actually know. This is completely away from the planet. And likewise, this is completely towards the planet. And you always see that there's always a line denoting which direction is the North Pole. Right here is the North Pole. And the 90-degree line, or the 270-degree line, depending on which side you're on, is the equator. So you can actually aim for an equatorial orbit if you were launching from Kerbal Space Center. You can launch at a 45-degree angle if you really want to, and then this marker right here, of course, is the direction of my current target, which right at the moment is the moon. Wrong button again. Whereas this marker is exactly facing the opposite direction of my target, which is, again, the moon. Now, for me, the best way for maneuvering is to use maneuver nodes. And you use a maneuver node by selecting your orbit. You see the little bubble following my pointer, right? Select a point by left-clicking, and you can add a maneuver node. Now, this lets you toy with all of the various ways that your orbit can change without actually burning your engine. I know that it can sometimes be... Oh, it was Minus. Select none. That was what I wanted to select. I know that it's sometimes a little hard to especially I had a hard time... I had a hard time getting the first lunar intercept during that tutorial mission. Just because they don't give you very clear instructions. They should have said to make a maneuver node. Because... Now look at what I can do. I'm still all the way over here. I'm at least 15 minutes away from the point where I need to start actually burning my engine. And I can sit here and goof around all day long with my orbit and how it works. Now, if you look, at least two of these symbols on the maneuver node should be familiar. This is your prograde marker. This is your retrograde marker. This is your normal marker, pointing towards north in this case. This is your anti-normal, pointing towards south in this case. You might consider it to be, if your orbit is counterclockwise, then normal will point upwards, and anti-normal will point downwards, as long as you're looking at it from the angle where you're orbiting counterclockwise. Maybe that's a good way of doing it. And then this marker right here is pointing towards the planet, and this marker right here is pointing away from the planet. And all you have to do to adjust your orbit is toy around with these little markers here, until the yellow line gets to what you want it to look like. So for our first trick, we're going to do a very simple maneuver called a transfer. I want to match orbits with this guy right here. To do that, I'm going to clear that maneuver node. Clear. Thank you. And technically I can do it from here. I'm going to burn prograde until my new apoapsis matches the orbit that I want to get to. One of those counterintuitive things I was talking about is that whatever you do on this side of the planet affects the opposite side of your orbit. So really, maneuvering on this side of the planet doesn't do you any good at all because it always affects the opposite side. So if you want to raise your apoapsis, then you have to start out at your periapsis or something close to it, or make a new periapsis to raise your apoapsis. So that's going to be our first trick. Let's bring that up so that we can just do it from here. So my velocity indicator tells me that I need to speed up by 99 meters a second. So by the time I'm done with this, I should be going 2330, thereabouts. Okay, so now my apoapsis is now at the orbit that I want to be at, but now, hey, what gives? Give me another note. Now, I'm going to want to burn prograde again on the opposite side to raise my periapsis. And this is called a Hohmann transfer, I believe is what this is called. Transfer orbit is just the same thing. So there we go. Zoom around to the other side. I want to zoom. I don't want to just go this speed. And if you do the transfer right, your velocity should be close, but not quite the same. It should always be a little bit easier to do your periapsis rise than it was to do your apoapsis rise. Just because here, it takes less energy the further out you go to change where your marker lines up. Versus closer to the ground, it takes more energy. That's why it takes so much energy to launch versus the amount of energy that it's taken me to just make these small little adjustments. So let's bring that up. And there's our transfer more or less. Close that. And we're done. We'll deal with intercepts next time. Next time will be intercepts and docking. This is just basically your basic maneuvers. That's going to be more of an advanced class there. Transferring the opposite direction, transferring from a higher orbit to oh, that was weird. I had a stroke, I guess. Transferring from a higher orbit to a lower orbit is more or less the same thing, just in the opposite order. So now, if I want to go back to the band that I was at, I can burn retrograde. I'm actually going to need to move that a little bit so I've got some time. I'm going to burn retrograde to slow myself down. You can actually keep these tabs up if you want to. It's a little bit hard sometimes. They're not cooperative. But you can left click on them. There you go. So that you're not constantly moving your mouse all over the place. And you know what? I'm going to rotate a little bit to make this a little easier. There we go. So this maneuver not only is how you would lower your orbit into a closer one, but also how you would, for example, land. That works good too, since that's the lowest orbit you really want to get. Soon, I mean, about it not cooperating. Good enough. I'm not going to be super picky about it. And then transfer back down is the same way. When you get to your periapsis, burn retrograde again to slow your apoapsis down. And transfer done. I could sit here and mess around with this to get it more even, but that's not a big deal right at the moment. As long as I'm not running into anything, as long as I'm not dipping below the atmosphere, I'm okay with it. So that's your simple transfer. What about a more complicated transfer? Let's say, for example, I want to transfer to the orbit that this particular spacecraft is on right now. Now, you notice that it's not just further out, and it's not just elliptical. It's actually got a little bit more eccentricity to it than the current orbit that I've got. How do I intercept this particular, how do I change my orbit so that it looks like that from where I am? Well, the same process happens. I should actually probably target it just to give myself a reference point. And we'll turn off that. So if you're trying to match an orbit with something else that's sort of in a wonky position, like Minmus, or say you're going to be really what's the word? Ambitious? And you're going to try to go for Elu. Well, Elu is way out there on a very, you can see it's very off-center orbit, so it's very elliptical, and it's also very inclined versus everything else. So say that that was your target. You want to learn how to do that. Well, this is a good place to start right here because we don't have to deal with a whole lot of extra burn time. So if you set it as your target, then you get not only how far off, this is 31 degrees difference between the orbit that I'm on now and the orbit that I want to be on. So I need to not only bring my periapsis up to 142 and bring my apoapsis up to 311, I also have to adjust my inclination here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I need to give myself a lot of time. So I'm going to come over here to the opposite side of the planet. And I'm going to start adjusting here. And inclination is one of those times. You actually want to do it sort of at the center of intersect. This little dotted line that's being traced from one orbit to another, that's where these two orbital paths sort of intersect. This is the best place to do a maneuver like this. No, don't go away. No. Bad note. Okay. So if you want to change your inclination, then you use the normal and anti-normal. See, I'm actually going the wrong way. I have to go anti-normal. There we go. And you see how it changes your inclination. It also changes your freaking periaps all over the place. So you have to actually monkey with this. That's why I needed to give myself more time than I was giving myself earlier. Now, there's a good chance you're not going to be able to do them both at the same time. So matching inclinations is a good idea first. And then we'll worry about the eccentricity later, because that's an easy one. We know how to do that. Damn it. And if you hover over the ascending node here, it'll tell you how close you are, how much further you need to get. 0.6, 0.8, 0.6, 0.4, Point 4 might be as close as I can get without moving this around a little bit. Point 2. Point 1. Oh, damn it. Burning out away from the planet is actually probably the most ineffective thing you can do. That's good enough. We'll call that good. Of course, you have to watch. See, by doing all those changes, I actually screwed my periapsis to the point where I'm actually going to re-enter the atmosphere. So now I need to make sure that I correct for that. That's good enough for me for now. Okay. Now, you notice that... change my ascending node again. Damn it. Okay, there we go. Now that's a lot of speed that I have to change. And that's the problem with these inclined orbits, is especially when you're close to the ground. When you are out further away, if I did this maneuver out here, this would take a whole lot less energy for me to change. But since I'm so close to the planet, I have a lot of distance that I have to cover. So that means that I have to change my speed in a lot of different directions all at once in order to get this to work. So this is a very ineffective way of doing this. If you want to launch into an inclined orbit, that's actually much easier than it is to launch into an equatorial orbit and then go from there. In fact, it's so difficult to launch from an equatorial orbit and then make your orbit polar, at least close to the ground, it's not even worth doing. If you want to make a polar orbit from the start, say you want to make a communication satellite in orbit around Kerbal, you want to actually launch polar orbit from the ground rather than launching westward or launching eastward and then trying to adjust it from there. It's really, really hard to do this. Not hard, but I should say fuel unfriendly. In fact, I might not even have enough fuel to make this maneuver, so we'll see what happens. So I'm all set. Let's get over here. I'm actually going to have to start burning at about 45 seconds because it's going to take me a minute and a half worth of burn time to be able to change my velocity that much. So I want to split the difference between the two, since it's not just a tiny adjustment I need to make. If it's a handful of seconds, then it's not a big deal, but something this major, you need to split the difference, otherwise everything's going to be thrown off. Oh shit, see, and I was not paying attention to what I was doing. I might have messed it up. So you can see my inclination is changing. My apoapsis shouldn't be changing a whole lot because I've counteracted for that. Yeah, I might not have enough fuel for this. We'll see. I guess at this point there's no reason why I can't put the fuel cheat on. Let's bring it up. Just in case. That might be as close as I'm going to get it on the first pass. That major inclination changes usually take a couple of tries. It's actually not too bad. It's only a degree off. And yeah, I'm going to turn infinite fuel on. I don't usually do the cheats, but today we're going to make an exception because this is a tutorial. This is not career mode. Okay, so now that we're on more or less the right inclination, how about we change our periapsis to match this particular orbit? Best place to do that would be right here. Actually, let's do it over here. And we're going to burn prograde to speed it up a little bit. Perhaps this is 42. Perhaps this should be at 142. It's not necessarily that it needs to be in a certain place. Actually, how about we do this? Let's finish that inclination maneuver. There we go. And it won't take us long for this burn here. Yep, a little too far. That's alright. That's close enough. Okay, and then we'll raise our periapsis up here. What did I say it was? 142. So burn prograde until our apoapsis is at 142. Although it does need to be aligned, doesn't it? There we go. So to see now they're aligned together here. Let's adjust that. Ah, damn. This is sort of that hard, tedious part of trying to line up two elliptical orbits. And burn. From here, bring the apoapsis up. There. So it's not perfect, but it's a very tedious sort of having to match kind of things. If you're trying to do an intercept, this is a lot more important, but we're good. We're not too bad. So now, imagine that we want to go to the moon. Well, I just made all those adjustments for nothing then, didn't I? Not really. We're just going to do the same thing. So now let's set the moon as our target. And we're going to do pretty much the exact same thing that we just did. The first part is to make it so that our inclination is roughly the same. I could try to intercept it this way, but it's going to be really hard to get the timing down right. So it'd be easier if I just change the inclination back to roughly the same plane. just a lot of tedious adjustments here and there, basically. Try to waste as little fuel as I can. Make it as efficient as possible. Okay, we'll call that one good. And reorient again. This is why I like having the navball extension. I don't have the mod installed right at the moment, but the navball extension lets me see where in relation all these little points are when they're off of the orb, and instead of having to just sort of randomly tumble around until you find it. I guess I'd turn that off too. And watch as both my Apple and parry change as well as my inclination. Although something weird happened to my inclination here. I'm not sure what happened. My inclination was at 0. So we'll eyeball it from here. That was weird. I wasn't paying attention to that. When I started adjusting my apoapsis and periapsis, my inclination changed, and I wasn't paying attention to that. See, that happens. So once it gets... we can account for that a little bit. Once it gets roughly parallel to the rest of it. That's probably as close as I'm going to get by eyeball. And we'll see how far off we are. Ah, see? Not too bad. So we'll do another one here. And was that descending? And that's good enough for me. Okay, so now we need to get an intercept with the moon. And the best way to get an intercept with the moon is to aim for a point about 90 degrees or so ahead of it. That put me right about here. Burn prograde until I get to roughly the spot where I need to be. And you see, so let me back up here a little bit. We saw a little bit of this when I was trying to intercept this other orbit. These markers here tell us where, in relation to our target, our closest approach is going to end up being. Now, ideally, you want to match those up. Do whatever you have to line them up. What? Oh, I didn't know that. I'm hovering over my prograde marker here, and I'm actually using my mouse wheel to change it. That was completely unplanned. I had no idea you could do that. That actually, sure, I like it. So as always, the goal here is to get... you can actually push them inward too. To get there using as little fuel as I can. So again, it's just a matter of lining things up. See, I just barely outside of its influence there, but now, there we go. That's probably about the most fuel efficient approach as I can get. Anything else, and I'm not quite close enough. Anything more, and I get burn too much fuel. So now that I've got that set, and you notice that the yellow line is my orbit that I'm planning. But the green line is what will happen if I just let the moon pass on by and I keep going. This is how much the orbit will change based on the moon's influence. It doesn't seem like a whole lot here, but when you start dealing with the moons of Joule or something like that, these become very, very important. For that matter, I could use the gravity of the moon to slingshot around. Now, what I'm going to do is called a free return orbit. What's going to happen is, as I swing around here. I'm going to get to the moon's influence right here, and then I'm going to basically start orbiting it in the opposite direction that I'm orbiting Kerbin, so that when I'm ready to leave, all I really have to do is burn just a little bit this way, and Kerbin's going to recapture me. It's basically a figure 8 profile is what it is. NASA used this to get to the real moon as a way of saving fuel, and in fact, it was a safety measure, I think, is how they designed it, so that the gravity of the moon would bring the capsule back to Earth without them having to burn it in case something happened to the engine. They would be basically returned for free, is why the name is what it is. If you watch Apollo 13, that didn't work out quite as well for them as they were hoping, but that was the idea behind it anyway. Did I just do it again? Alright, it didn't change much. I noticed the ascending node changed a little bit. Wow, now I gotta watch out for that, because I zoom using my scroll wheel a lot, and that's gonna be disorienting. So, okay, let's get myself pointed the right direction. Where is that marker? This is... Damn it! This is what I was talking about. This is why I like having that nav ball enhancer. There we go. So I know exactly where the frickin' thing is. Okay, good to go. Start burning nowish. I believe this is called the approach, maybe the injection burn. I don't remember which term this is, but basically it's no different than doing a transfer orbit, and it's actually the exact same thing. I'm doing a transfer, just doing it from a much lower location to a much higher location than I was around here around Kerbal. Same idea though. Now, the real trick is you're going to see the apoapsis climb faster and faster and faster as it gets further away, because... Yeah, see, I burned a little bit too much fuel, but that's okay. It's still well within. But you notice how much difference there is between the blue line and the purple line versus how much difference there was between the yellow and the purple last time. Just that little tiny bit of extra thrust makes a big difference when you start talking about distances that far away. So now, I would like to make maneuver nodes here, but in my experience, they haven't really worked very well. So you've got two new points on your marker here. You've got this point here, which is where you start encountering the moon's gravity to the point where it can start influencing you. And this point is where you leave the lunar gravity. Moon escape is what that is. And when you would be returned to Kerbin's influence rather than the moon's. And this yellow spot right here is when you're in the influence of the moon. Navigational nodes don't work too well in my experience that far out, so the only thing I can really do is turbo mode all the way out to the moon and counterpoint, and then plan my next maneuver there. And you can see the moon catching up to us. Even though we burn way ahead of it, the moon is still moving in space while we get out here. And we're about to catch up to it here. And watch how the physics engine is forced to... The navigational system is still a little clunky when it comes to encountering other bodies. I'm not sure I like it, but I'm not sure that I could come up with a better solution either, so I just kind of work with what I have, keep my mouth shut. That's a shocker. And notice how slow we're going, too. We were going a couple of thousand meters a second closer to the surface. Now we're only going a couple of hundred. That's something to note. Okay, now, this is how it changes. This looks incredibly strange, right? That's because it kind of is. Now, this blue line here isn't necessarily where we're going, because we're still traveling in the same direction that we were before. This blue line basically represents the amount of influence that the moon is going to have on us, and this yellow is where we'll end up if we don't do anything. Now, as I fast forward time again, you'll notice that this blue bar actually moves in space more towards the yellow as we get closer. But this periapsis here is the periapsis to the moon, so since that's the best place to do a maneuver, I'm going to burn... is it prograde? No, I'm going to burn retrograde. I'm going to burn retrograde until I get a closed orbit. In fact, I'm going to make it as wide as I can for the moment. Or not. Let's do a close pass instead. Let's continue burning retrograde until you can get really close to the moon. The moon has no atmosphere, so there's no need to worry about getting slowed down by it. A little bit too far. I'm going to try to skim it. There we go. That should be interesting. I hope there's no mountains higher than 5 kilometers. This should be a very interesting maneuver here. Okay. So now that I've got my maneuver node set where it needs to go, we can fast forward a little bit and watch as the blue bar not only shrinks with the passage of time, but everything is moving in relation to the moon right now, except for the yellow. The yellow stays in relation to Kerbin, because that is our Kerbin orbit if nothing else changes. Again, it's kind of a weird system, but it does work once you figure out what it's doing. The first couple of times I tried this, it was confusing as all hell what it was trying to tell me. Fast forward a little bit faster because I don't want to wait here forever. And you'll notice that the amount of speed that I need to change is actually not very far. In fact, it's not very much different than the speed that I'm currently at right now, just because the moon has so little gravity compared to Kerbin, and we're so far away from Kerbin. The further out from gravity you get, the easier these maneuvers get. So whenever possible, it's actually beneficial to you to do highly elliptical orbits and then do complicated stuff. Whenever possible. Do your maneuvers at the apoapsis if you can. Just because it's a little bit more fuel efficient to do it. And I'm not even pointed the right fragging direction, am I? Yep. And I'm a little tiny bit late. That's right. And you notice my Kerbin orbit's also changing as a result, but we expected that. So now we're no longer in orbit of Kerbin. We are in orbit of the moon. And this is the one I want to be careful with, because I really don't want to smack on the surface. So keep it. Use that to keep that up. And just very small amounts of thrust now. I barely have the throttle out at all. That might be too close. Looks like my line's disappearing a little bit. So let's... Now to adjust that, let's burn a tiny bit prograde. Just a tiny bit. I said a tiny bit, damn it. Actually, you know what? Now's a good time to start talking about... Let's talk about the RCS thruster, shall we? I'm gonna put myself prograde here. Let's talk about the RCS thrusters. Now I put these things on here, and so far I haven't used them. That's because I've got reaction wheels on this on the ship that allows me to turn without blowing any fuel out. You've all seen it when the space shuttle used to maneuver. It used to blow out little jets of gas, sort of like a fire extinguisher. Or if you've watched Gravity, exactly like a fire extinguisher. I haven't been using these because I haven't needed them, because I've got little, basically rumble packs in here, just like the rumble pack in your Xbox controller or something like that. little gyroscopes inside the ship, inside here and inside here, that turn me using only electricity. I don't have to use any fuel. So I can turn as much as I want as long as I still have power. But now we're going to turn on the RCS thrusters, the green button right here. And I'm going to go into docking mode. And I'm going to hope that I get this button right. Now you see the jets working? I'm not actually rotating, I'm actually, these are lateral thrusters. These are going to be very important during the docking tutorial, but right now I'm going to use them because they're very fuel efficient and very low thrust. I'm going to use them to adjust my orbit here. Oh, damn it. Took me out of docking mode. Oh, alright, fine. I'll turn Kerbal Engineer on. Apparently it doesn't want to let me do docking mode at the same time. Let's try that again. And RCS on. And I'm going to watch my periapsis here. There we go. See how just a little squirt, that's what she said, is enough to bring my periapsis down just a tiny bit, or massive amounts actually, so, you know, almost a kilometer at a time. So that'll be good enough for me. We can turn the RCS thrusters off. We'll get more into RCS thrusters and how useful they are and how infuriating they can be. We'll do that the next time. But for now, we might still crash. I might still crash. I don't want to crash. I'm partial to not crashing. I don't know why. So let's bring Kerbal Engineer back in just one jet. One more jet. Not too much. One more jet. that crater, or that canyon there is really strange. Okay, that might be as close as I can get to the surface safely. Alright, we'll go with that. And RCS off. Tune in next time when we slap into the moon. Curbs of Our Lives. No, we need to think of a name for a good soap opera, I think. I think I see an asteroid over here. There's a lot of parallax here. It's not moving with the rest of the background stars. I want to investigate that now. Oh, damn. Oh, that's my miss. You're okay. I knew I saw something. Never mind. Moving on. Something was not moving in line with the background stars. That's how planets are actually found, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, we're... actually bring the engineer up here. And come back here. And see the moon get very big. See how close we can get to it here. I'm hoping that I could get close enough that if I really wanted to, I could probably land Jebediah here without the spaceship. The RCS thruster pack it carries might be enough, even if I turn the fuel cheat off, to get him to land more or less safely on the moon as his spacecraft continues to fly on by. don't know if that would actually work. Okay, I have turned time acceleration off, so this is how fast and how close we are to the moon. So we're traveling at almost 800 meters a second. These mountains are a little bit troubling. And we are currently, you know, close. Here, let's change our camera. Orbital, chase, auto, free. That'll work. This is your extreme sports moment in Kerbal Space Program. Lunar mountain skimming. How close can ye get? Oh. Concerning. Yeah, that's very concerning. Well, that's a shame.